together and they decided, well, who's going to introduce whom? I said, can I just, I don't care about anybody else. Can I introduce Sofi Thanhauser? and I got to. So Sofi is a very modest writer, artist, and musician, one of those people, based in Brooklyn. She's one of those people that would be great to sit next to at a dinner party because she would have something to say on anything. The breadth and depth of her talents are widely recognized as she has received fellowships from the Fulbright, MacDowell, Ucross, and Lay Colony, among others. Her work has appeared in Vox, The Guardian, Observer Magazine, Dane, and Lit.Hub. She's here today because of this incredible new book, Warm. This book has everything that I love to read about. It has social justice, it has history, it has women's studies, and it has killers. So author Peggy Orenstein summed it up beautifully when she said, Sofi Thanhauser's history of cloth is not just about clothing, it is about ethics, workers' rights, women's progress, climate justice. It is about the fabric of who we are. And as told in Warm, it also makes an absolutely gripping read. I couldn't agree more. Sofi Thanhauser.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Star. That was probably the best introduction I've ever had. How is the mic? Is it great? Oh, okay.
Well, it could be a little louder.
A little louder? Really happy to be at this festival and to be under this Faith Ringgold quilt and next to this picture of Rachel Carson. I feel that I'm in really good company up here. And thank you all for coming out. I'm gonna give a little bit of an introduction to some of the themes that I cover in the book. If you haven't read it, it'll be a little tour of what you could expect in reading it, and if you have read it, maybe there'll be something new to enjoy, I hope. I don't really know how to use this.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. This is a picture of me as a teenager. I'm holding a plate of ham, and I'm wearing a dress made out of paper, and I'm looking pretty smug in this photograph, but what I'm about to discover is that paper is not really an appropriate fabric. I was very utopian and decided at some point that it was ridiculous that humans had been dressing all this time in clothing made out of cloth, and thought we were pretty tragically small-minded and suggested that we all wear paper dresses to the party. I think this was New Year's in 2001. Anyways, when you wear paper, it rips when you get out of the car, and it rips when you dance in it, and by the time you go home, you're more or less naked. And this was an experience that gave me a respect for fabric. This is the oldest known shirt in the world. It was found in Egypt by a British archaeologist. It's from 3000 BC, and when the archaeologist dug it up, he threw it off to the side where it was to go on to sit in a box labeled funerary rags until 1970. This was in 1912. It sat in a box until the 1970s, where two female curators discovered what it is, which is an incredibly elaborately pleated shirt that would allow the wearer to move their arms and not have restricted movement, but still have a really nice structured look. And this shirt is made of linen, which is one of the oldest fabrics there is. Pretty much all of the most ancient textiles, or even pulverized, powdered versions of textiles that we have discovered, are made of some kind of vegetable fiber, like linen. And what else did I want to say about this? Oh yeah, that the history of fabric is it's hard to figure out because it erodes and breaks down in a way that, say, stone or objects made of metal don't. And so I think it's been a harder thing for archaeologists to think and talk about, but I think a second reason why it has sometimes been undervalued is that it is the product largely of women. And in many times and places and cultures, women have been the mainstay of fabric production. So I'm going to go on now to this very elaborate sampler. So, in colonial New England, where this sampler was made, linen was made with the labor of the village, with men sowing and harvesting flax and women spinning and weaving it. Women's property rights in America were set by the English common law concept of coverture. Married women legally owned nothing, but by custom they possessed the linens. Unlike land, which can be traced in deeds, movables flowed outside the law. But it is possible to trace lines of female inheritance because women took care to mark their linens with their initials, if not their full names. This is a sampler made by a 9-year-old girl in which she's practicing her stitches. But at the time that this sampler was made in the 19th century, linen was on its way out, and so was hand spinning and hand weaving, because at the end of the 18th century came the rise of a new phenomenon, industrially manufactured fabric, increasingly made from cotton. Cotton is a beautiful plant, although these ones are a little bit sad looking because they've just been sprayed with paraquat, which is a chemical defoliant that's very similar to Agent Orange, to wilt its leaves. Basically, when you suck up cotton in a cotton stripper, if there's any live plant material, it will gum up the machinery, so farmers spray it with paraquat to wilt the leaves before they do that. It's hard to believe that a plant with such soft, appealing, fluffy fiber has a history that is full of violence, but it's true. These cotton plants are in Lubbock, Texas, and they're about to be harvested with a cotton stripper. But cotton in the US was once picked by enslaved people, and after that by sharecroppers, often living in a state of perpetual debt. Cotton monoculture can be hard not only on the labor, but also on the land. Soil gives out if it is planted over and over with cotton, and cotton is extremely thirsty. These cotton plants are drinking from the Ogallala aquifer, which is dropping year by year. But the story of mass-produced cotton doesn't really start in the United States. It starts in India. This is a picture I took in Tamil Nadu. The largest and most celebrated exporter of cotton fabric historically was India. When the British East India Company began trading goods from the Indian subcontinent, this quickly became their biggest product. As the British gained political power over the subcontinent, they forced a historic shift. They made India into a market for British fabric. This fabric was made with new machines that could turn cotton into cloth with much greater speed than a human hand. The Industrial Revolution, when you really get down to it, was a fabric revolution. The women in this photo are in southern India, and they're creating a bale of cotton to be processed by these machines. Traditionally, Indian cotton would have been ginned and spun and woven and dyed locally by a sophisticated network of village artisans. The British broke up those networks in order to remove a source of competition and in order to force India to become a source of raw cotton. The legacy of the globalization of the cotton trade is still not finished. Forced labor seems to haunt the cotton plant wherever it goes. Today in the western Chinese province of Xinjiang, Uyghurs imprisoned in internment camps are forced to help with the cotton crop. It is a historical irony that these cotton fields should be located in a part of the world that has been traditionally famous for another fabric entirely, silk. These are silkworms. They feed on mulberry leaves, and the cocoons they make to transform into moths can be unspooled and woven to make a strong, beautiful fiber called silk. Compared to linen, which arrived on the scene about 36,000 years ago, silk is a relative newcomer. It appears on the archaeological record somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, and for much of its history, it remained exclusively in Asia, but it captured the imagination of the whole world. During Roman times, Chinese silk that traveled across Central Asia defined the luxury of the imperial court. Sericulture, which is the manufacture of silk, began in Byzantium under Justinian and reached the Arab world by the 9th century. The Crusades acquainted Western Europe with sericulture, and the first mulberry tree was brought to France from Syria in 1147. Silk made in Lyon and Tours defined the splendor of the court of Louis XIV in the years when Paris became the fashion capital of the world. Laws regulated who could wear silk, and when these laws fell into disuse, the pace of imitation of the bourgeois woman to the aristocratic woman, for example, became so frantic that some scholars point to this moment as the birth of fashion as we know it. In the late 19th century arrived what was at first known as fake silk, or rayon, the world's first synthetic fiber. These are workers at a rayon plant in Elizabethton, Tennessee. The girls in the plant sometimes fainted, one worker recalled, because of mysterious fumes from the churn room. The fumes were from the chemical solvent carbon disulfide, which is used to break down the wood pulp. Rayon is made from wood, and it still affects workers today in India. Although they fought a good fight, the textile workers of the South never did achieve a union. But up north, it was a different story. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union represented about 70% of all women's apparel workers by 1935. I think when we think of garment work, we tend to think of sweatshops, but that isn't how it has to be. In fact, the ILGWU helped ensure that for much of the 20th century, garment workers in America earned a good middle-class living. After World War II, pent-up demand for a new DuPont synthetic fabric called nylon erupted into riots. Nylon was the first synthetic made entirely from petroleum, and it was to reshape the look and feel of post-war clothing. But there were other political factors that would reshape clothing also. After World War II, Japan was occupied by the Allies under General Douglas MacArthur. One of MacArthur's first priorities was to rebuild Japan's textile industry because it was believed this would help prevent Japan from becoming communist. The US State Department poured money into rebuilding infrastructure and textile capacity in Japan and opened US markets to Japanese cloth and eventually clothing. Similar efforts to help build up textile capacity in Taiwan, South Korea, and Hong Kong. I'm reading. And there's a word missing there. We did the same thing in Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan. In the post-war period, the Asian exports would come to undermine the US textile and garment industries. This is a picture I took from an export processing zone in Ho Chi Minh City. From 1974 to 2005, a system of tariffs called the multi-fiber arrangement protected the US garment industry from total collapse. With the end of this tariff regime, it was pretty much game over for the US industry. A good deal of clothing today is made in export processing zones, which are like mini legal entities inside of other countries that have a separate set of laws on taxation and sometimes on labor. However, as the garment industry has grown huge and globalized, there is a contrary movement playing out across the US and across the world. People are interested in looking to the small. Often, they are enthusiasts of another fiber that is very ancient, wool. This picture is from a sheep docking in Wyoming that I attended as a researcher, but I ended up getting roped into inoculating sheep. Some of today's textile enthusiasts are continuing old traditions, like the Navajo weaver Marlo Katoni, seen here in front of some beautiful wool yarn hand-dyed with local plants. And in 2018, I traveled to Woolfest in Cumbria, England, to see how much a community of sheep breeders, spinners, weavers, knitters, and dyers can do when they put their mind to it. I bought this sweater, which is made from the wool of a Wensleydale long wool, a sheep that has curly hair from its belly right down to the ground. As you can see, I've come a long way from my paper dress. This sweater doesn't rip when I walk, and although it isn't a radical new invention, I've come to accept and even to like the fact that making wool sweaters is something humans have been up to for thousands of years, and they've come to be pretty good at it. So that's the end of that. I don't know what we should believe about, but that's my. And I just hope to give you a little bit of a sense of the scope of the book. And now I thought I would read just a little bit and then maybe open it up to any questions you might have. I'm going to read from a section that I've never read from before. I'm not exactly sure why, maybe because I'm thinking about crisis and maybe because, I don't know, the Brattleboro audience, this section's speaking to me for some reason. In 1978, as the world worried over what it called an energy crisis, the Croatian-Austrian social critic Ivan Illich took aim at this term, asserting a crisis of another kind. For Illich, the problem wasn't running out of carbon, but what reliance on it was doing to humans. To him, quote, high quanta of energy degrade social relations just as inevitably as they destroy the physical milieu, unquote. Wyoming's scarred landscape, so I have just been in the previous section at a coal, like a strip mining operation in Wyoming, in Wyoming's Powder River Basin. Wyoming's scarred landscape with its earth-rattling Bucyrus dragline and its shepherds enduring solitary confinement on subarctic plains seemed to validate Illich's assessment. As the warming climate became undeniable, Illich's voice became more insistent. Pre-industrial ethics, he argued in 1989, had held that, quote, technology was a measured tribute to necessity, not the implement to facilitate mankind's chosen action, unquote. Reversing that relationship had unleashed disaster. By 1989, the warming atmosphere made it, quote, intolerable to think of industrial growth as progress, he wrote. It was, in fact, aggression against the human condition. The solution, Illich believed, lay in a radical reorientation of men and machines, one that would provide a universal outlet for the one resource evenly distributed among people, individual genius. Like Illich, many of the people re-envisioning fabric are interested not in throwing out the machine and abandoning technology, but revising its use and adjusting its scale. This group includes among its ranks many sheep and wool enthusiasts. It also includes another American subculture engaged in small-scale production and the resuscitation and reinvention of old technologies, denim heads. These are these are young, mostly men, who developed an interest in narrow shuttle looms made by heritage American companies like Crompton & Knowles or Draper because of their love of Japanese selvage denim. The selvage refers to the long, neat edge along both sides of a bolt of cloth. To weave, threads are strung taut in a row, parallel to one another. These parallel threads, which remain still during the weaving process, are called the warp. The thread that is woven under and over these threads at perpendicular is called the weft. To move the weft thread through the warp for nearly all of the history of weaving, you needed a shuttle. The motion of the shuttle creates the selvage, and in the multitudinous moments when the weft thread reaches the end and turns around, in that moment. The power loom, which was first used in the late 18th century, is essentially a hand loom with a motor strapped on. It throws a wooden shuttle back and forth, carrying a little supply of thread wound on a quill. Then in the 1960s, a Swiss company called Sulzer developed a machine that did away with the shuttle. Instead of using one continuous weft, the Sulzer loom shot individual threads across, one by one, using pneumatic pressure. The wider shuttleless loom ran much faster with fewer technical challenges than the clattering cast iron power looms. Only one thing was lost when the Swiss looms were adopted by the manufacturers: the selvage. The selvage is a valuable thing for making a garment because it doesn't need to be hemmed. It will never fray on its own. With denim, the selvage had found an unlikely fame. When denim looms were designed, they were made to produce a bolt of cloth just wide enough to allow for the leg pieces of trousers to be cut along the selvage, leaving enough space in between to cut extras like the pockets, the fly cover, and the waistband. Newer looms dispensed with this practice. They also eliminated the selvage down the outer seam of both trouser legs. Instead, the raw edges would have to be gone over with a kind of zigzag stitch to keep them from fraying. The selvage, however, is beautiful. There is a thoughtful economy to the way it connects weaving fabric with sewing it into a garment. This alone could account for nostalgia for selvage denim and the narrow shuttle loom. But selvage denim's rise in the late 19th century and fade beginning in the 1960s, alongside the myth of American exceptionalism, also tracked the rise and fall of American industrial engineering and labor. By the end of the 1980s, selvage denim had disappeared from America. Denim became paler, wider, shoddier. Virtuosity on the part of the Japanese would ultimately rehabilitate it. In post-war Japan, a fascination with American youth culture had prompted fashions that took the form of facsimiles more ingenious than the originals. As denim factories in the American South transitioned to wider style looms that allowed them to weave more material and cut costs as they faced dire threats from Asian manufacturers, Japanese producers developed the process of weaving selvage denim on narrow looms into a high art. Fixated on the minutiae of American menswear, they developed slow manufacturing processes that imitated the errors produced originally by the rocking of a cast iron loom on a wooden factory floor in North Carolina. Magazines like Popeye, launched in Tokyo in 1976, minutely documented LA fashion and particularly the clothing on the UCLA campus in their inaugural issue. It's a weird place to stop, but that's where I'm going to stop, right there. A little taste of the book itself and some thoughts on selvage denim, which maybe you're familiar with, I'm not sure, maybe you're not. But it's a subculture. Does anyone have any questions they wanted to ask about the book or about the creative practice or about research or anything? Yeah.
So you're,
Oh, sorry.
well, after writing this book, did your way of going shopping for your own change, become an extremely lengthy process, or?
Actually, I had passed through phases of like more and less intense purism prior to writing this book. Like I had agonized over these questions for a lot of years, and like that process manifested both in my own wardrobe and in my own ultimately research towards the book. So writing the book helped me kind of just like sort of work through a lot of feelings, including a lot of rage that I felt towards some of the systems that I attempt to describe. But I don't think it changed the way I dress very much, which is a pretty stable. It's pretty stable, and partly that's just because I really love thrift shopping. Like it's something I treasure as a pastime. So mostly that is how I have done my shopping in the past, and is how I continue to do my shopping, which is not for everyone, but it is like something that and it's partly because a thrift store to me is an archive, and there's so much to learn about history in thrift store. And I spent last fall in Budapest, where I had never been, and I had sort of become almost like tired of American thrift stores, where I was like, yeah, I know this, oh, okay, like you're Taiwan, Hong Kong, like next, like I was kind of familiar with like the trade regimes of the archive, and then I was in Budapest and I was like, made in Finland, like what's going on with this? Like I don't even really understand the Soviet bloc like trading pattern, so it was like a whole new archive to get into. But I think I wandered a little bit off the topic of your question. Maybe I would say like I did make some money when I got like a book advance when I got a book deal, and I bought like a nice new thing. Which is something that I'm not against buying new stuff, you know, but like I wanted to buy something really nice, like something made by someone I met, which is, you know, more expensive. And so I think that's probably the main thing that changed, is my willingness to buy a couple of new things. Thank you for the question.
So I'll just say, as I'm bringing the microphone back here, that we do have the best thrift store ever in this town. So if you hot put it down, you know.
But start by everything that's really worthwhile.
Yeah, just use my name when you go.
You see her going in and you're like, I'll forget about it. Yeah.
Hi, so do I have to press something?
No, you're good.
Okay. I don't need this. Anyway, so my understanding is that Egyptian cotton is considered to be like the best cotton for sheets, linens, and things like that. Why?
I'm not an expert in Egyptian cotton, and I think partly that is a marketing thing, but I think that
No, it's not a marketing thing.
okay.
I bought all the various cottons, okay? And recently I had to get something for a new place, okay? And I went to I actually went to Macy's. They had a big sale in New Jersey, right? And I spoke to this woman and I said, I just want regular sheets. She said, the salesperson said, no, you need Egyptian cotton sheets. I said, why? She said, try one set, okay, and you'll understand why. So I tried one set. After that, all Egyptian cotton when they go on sale. Okay? But it's, you know, it's like it's a hard finish to it, right? At least that's my observation.
That's good. Maybe you can tell me why.
Well, it has a hard finish to it, okay, and it's like cool, right? Okay, other cottons, I think it has something to do with the nature of the fiber. Other cottons, on a warm night, the cottons are hot, right? Whereas Egyptian cotton being really kind of a hard finish, it's really cool. That's why I use it.
That's a wonderful observation. Thank you.
Next time you do this presentation, check it out, okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that picture of the shirt fascinated me. It looks so modern. When I'm going to think Roman and Greek and always see these togas, and I'm always thinking, my gosh, that had to be pretty uncomfortable to always be wearing those drapery things. Were people wearing shirts like the Egyptian one in the ancient world? Obviously the Egyptians were, and Egyptian cotton, but aside from that.
There's a really wonderful unhinged book that I read while I was doing research. It's called A History of Ladies' Undergarments by Cecil de Laurent. And it includes this really fascinating rant about the difference between the draped and the sewn. And what he's talking about is that distinction that you described, like some cultures predominantly wear draped clothing, like you could describe the sari worn in India today as a draped garment, whereas what we wear almost exclusively, except for maybe we were to wear a sarong in the summer, is sewn, as in tubes. Like it's, and he considered it like a political thing. Like he associated the draped with Athens and the sewn with Sparta and fascism, basically, because it rigidly creates the shape into which our bodies must conform, rather than a draped garment which kind of accommodates itself to the body of the wearer, which I was sort of receptive to as an argument. But it also, I think, has something to do with weather, and whether you want, a lot of air under how do you want airflow to be operating. But I spent a little time in India when I was researching this book, and it was quite stunning to me to get to observe that, really there are not very many parts of the world where the kind of Western costume has not become standard. And that's part of the story I tried to tell in Warren, is how this happened. So to be in a place where the costume style is really quite different, and I found it very beautiful and very comfortable looking also. So I was attracted by that. Do you want the microphone?
I don't think I need it. Your research is technical, and you research like a historian. I don't know if I missed it in the introduction, but what is your I'm curious about your background, and your articulation of the history is magnificent, and I'm just wondering, did you already have that interest or skill set before you started the book?
Thank you very much for saying that. My undergraduate major was history, and I considered doing a PhD in history and decided against it, although I still am tempted by that idea, really. I was trained to a certain extent in using an archive or using primary and secondary sources. But I think I had a sense as in my 20s, that had a strong sense that I didn't want to become a specialist. and I felt that there was something important about not becoming a specialist. And it didn't really make sense to me, and it made my life a lot more difficult for a lot of years, actually. And it wasn't until I, in my late 20s, realized that I wanted to be a writer and realized that there actually was like a market niche for this thing of commercial nonfiction, that I felt like this is actually what I want to do, which is to use a lot of academic research and to get into that, those sources, but to produce a product that laymen can read and to try to synthesize the work. So I relied on so many different academics, like life's work, that I couldn't have made this book without them. But I wanted to try to synthesize information from across a lot of different disciplines. Because I think that academic disciplines can sometimes obscure really important stories, ironically. And so I felt that the kind of storytelling I wanted to do demanded working in a different frame and with a different kind of language. So it's actually a really important part of my project to try to use language that people can understand and that I can understand too. So I appreciate the observation a lot. Thank you.
So, I'm sorry. I found out why Egyptian cotton is so special.
Why is it?
It's a longer fiber, a narrower fiber, it's stronger, it's cooler. So in warm weather, as I said earlier, in warm weather it keeps you cool, and apparently for some reason in cold weather it keeps you warm. So let's Google it, it's amazing.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so you mentioned like the world's oldest shirt, how it was kind of just thrown in a box because it's, clothing is like women's deals. Did you find it was tough to find thorough sources, like especially on older garments and stuff, because it was considered to be less important than like a painting or a statue?
That's a good question. I think sort of following off of what I said just in answer to this question, I think like I really see myself as as resting on like the work of a lot of like 70s feminist historians who actually had, like, for them I think they were starting not exactly from scratch but more or less, but for me I felt like there was a lot of women like Alice Kessler Harris who had like, or what's the name of the woman who wrote the book? Elizabeth Wayland Barber. Like there are people who have like actually kind of gotten in and dealt with a lot of this stuff. And Ellen Rosen wrote a book called Making Sweatshops, which is sort of tells the story of the US involvement in Asia in the post-war period. And it's such a fascinating story. And it was just this little teeny academic book that like did that work, that necessary work. And so I felt in a way that I was just transmitting her. I'm sure it is still true that there's a lot more work to be done.
How, or did you find any effect of the Silk Road on the transfer of technology, fabric, et cetera, across the history?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't like uncover anything new, but it was certainly a really interesting thing to read about. And I think one of the things that I was interested in was in the spread of Buddhism and the way that the Silk Road and the spread of Buddhism happened. And I was in a textile museum in China, actually, and there was a really beautiful display of different sun motifs, and it was like Helos, like the sun god Helos, and then there was like a Iranian version of the sun god, and it was just showing different motifs of gods who had kind of traveled back and forth across the Silk Road, and religions had been impacted by each other. Your question's about technology, which I'm not really answering, but I think to me, I was most moved by the way that religion was moving and transforming, and texts were being translated, and this was like then revealing new things to people about language, and that actually had some like downstream effects on poetry, because people were learning like when you translate things, they don't work the same, so maybe what's so special about the Chinese language, and that like changed the way that they were doing poetry. So I think maybe my mind, perhaps because of my interest, went more towards like the language and cultural exchange, but you're right that it was a huge transmitter, not just of fabric, but of cultural ideas across that territory. Yeah.
You already.
Sorry. Maybe we'll go there and then to you next. Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
You were a Fulbright scholar too. Which country did you go first? Or did
I
you
went
go
to
more?
Budapest on a Fulbright, and that was actually when I had finished writing this book. So I was beginning to work on a new project, but still was interested in textiles there, and took a tapestry class. Actually, it was a really fabulous experience because I don't speak Hungarian, and none of the women spoke any English. So it's like 4 hours every week of just sitting in a room with a bunch of women, understanding nothing, but doing tapestry with one another. It was very, very cool.
Did you include that story in the book?
I did not. I'm just telling you now. Thank you for your question. Did you have a question?
Yeah, the photograph on the cover is so lovely. I was wondering where that young lady came from, and if you knew her or if you just found that photograph somewhere.
I don't know her. I think she's in North Carolina.
Oh. She's wearing some kind of woven.
So it's actually a little boy. It's the face. The woman who made that image uses a lot of collage and found images, and she took the face of a little boy from an encyclopedia, and then she wove together a text. I actually don't know what the text is to form the headpiece that the boy is wearing in the image.
Very pretty.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure what this question is, but given the scope of the book, and you did speak about Ivan Illich, and who's, I love him as a social philosopher, just astounding. But he sort of painted a picture about where we were going and had ideas about where we should be going. And based on your book, do you, someone asked if you changed the way you purchase clothes based on the research, but do you have any thoughts or, advice for others going forward about either how to make personal choices themselves or how to affect the future for both, not only fabric, but how we produce and go into the next centuries and so on. Not further affect climate change because of it, and just here.
Yeah. Well, I've tried as much as I can to avoid making proclamations, but I do think it's important that I say a couple things. And I try to, at the end of the book, first of all, I think that in a way, there are problems that are really, really big and structural and global, and that I sort of dislike it when we, the consumers, are like at fault. It's like, if these Gen Zs would stop buying Shein, then everything would be fine. Like the way that it's written about is often very blamey, especially to the young. And so I think part of what I felt my role could be was to talk a little bit about the way we got here, which was a political process, and it remains a political reality that it's possible to skip around the world to get labor wherever you want it and then import it into the US. I mean, there's an interesting thing happening now because it is illegal to import cotton from Xinjiang into the US because of what's happening there. But it's very difficult to make sure that cotton in a shirt, for example, from Vietnam doesn't contain cotton grown in China. It's incredibly complicated. So I think one of the most optimistic things that I have found is that there are a lot of people who are really interested and invested in rethinking ways to make supply chains smaller and more local. And I think that's quite exciting and positive to think about. So there's an organization called Fibershed, which has like a similar, it's sort of like a watershed. They try to connect people in a region who are, say, producing wool or dyeing or operating like a felting operation. And that's not a solution like for tomorrow, but the impulse to start to build smaller networks of production, I think, is a very exciting one, personally. And I think it's also, for me as someone who actually really loves textiles, nice to think about what I can become enthusiastic about, like, not like, oh, this gross, horrible stuff, which I, believe me, have a lot of feelings and thoughts about also. But to find a couple things to be enthusiastic has been important to me, I think. And that is one of the things about which I'm enthusiastic.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you, and thank you for being such an enthusiastic. And